There are 4 verses in the Bible that the Bible refuses to explain. They sit near the beginning of Genesis, just before the flood. They describe something happening between heaven and earth that shouldn't be possible. And then the text stops, changes the subject, and never comes back to it. 4 verses, no explanation, and then a flood that ends the world. For 2,000 years, serious people have argued about what those verses mean, and they've landed in 3 completely different places. Not because anyone is being careless, because the text genuinely will not settle it. Open Genesis to chapter 6. It tells you that as people multiplied on the earth, the sons of God saw that the daughters of men were beautiful, and they took them as wives, any they chose. And it says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men and had children by them, the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. Now read verse 5. And notice that the subject has completely changed. Verse 5 is about human wickedness and God's grief and the decision to send a flood. Whatever just happened in those 4 verses is not explained, not defined, not returned to. 4 verses, and then the text simply walks away. And that's strange, because Genesis is not a book that rushes. It slows down for genealogies. It gives you the ages of men who lived and died and did nothing else worth recording. It tells you the exact dimensions of a boat. And then it drops the single strangest sentence in the book. The sons of God took human wives, and offers no explanation whatsoever. So who were they? That's the question this whole video is built on, and I want you to hold me to it. Because there are 3 serious answers. They have been argued for about 2,000 years, and I'm going to give you all 3 properly. The strongest case for each, and the strongest objection to each, instead of pretending my favorite is obvious.
And here's what I'll tell you now. I'm not going to end this by telling you that you have to believe one of them. What I am going to show you is what those 4 verses were actually pointing at. Because by the end, they stop looking like a curiosity worth skipping and start looking like a door that opens onto the reason the flood came at all. Stay with me for that part. But first, the phrase itself, because in Hebrew, this is much more specific than English lets on. The words are bene ha-elohim, sons of God. Now, here's the detail that shapes the entire debate, and most people have never been told it. That exact construction, bene ha-elohim, with the definite article, appears in the Hebrew Old Testament exactly 5 times.
2 of them are here, in Genesis 6, verses 2 and 4. The other 3 are all in the book of Job. Chapter 1, verse 6, chapter 2, verse 1, and chapter 38, verse 7. And in Job, there is no ambiguity about who they are. Job chapter 1 opens with a scene in heaven. The sons of God come to present themselves before the Lord, and Satan comes among them. That's a heavenly court. Those are not human beings. They're spiritual beings standing before God's throne. And Job 38 is the moment God finally answers Job out of the whirlwind. And he asks him where he was when the foundations of the earth were laid, when the morning stars sang together, and all the sons of God shouted for joy.
At the founding of the world, before there were any humans at all. So the same exact phrase, in the only other places it appears, unmistakably means heavenly beings. That's the argument, and it's a strong one. It's the reason the oldest interpretation of Genesis 6, the one held by the earliest Jewish writers, by the book of Enoch, by Josephus, and by a number of the early church fathers, was that these were angelic beings who crossed a boundary they were never meant to cross. And it's worth knowing how far back that reading goes, because it's further than most people assume. Josephus was a 1st century Jewish historian, not a Christian, writing for a Roman audience, trying to explain Jewish history to outsiders.
And when he gets to this passage in his Antiquities of the Jews, he doesn't hedge. He writes that angels of God had relations with women and produced sons who were overbearing and contemptuous of every good thing, trusting in their own strength. And then he adds a comparison his Greek readers would immediately understand. He says the tradition resembles what the Greeks said about their giants. That's a Jewish historian, writing around the same time as the New Testament, treating the angelic reading as simply what the text says, not as a fringe theory, as the standard understanding. And he's not alone. The Septuagint, the Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible made a couple of centuries before Christ, renders sons of God in Genesis 6 as angeloi tou theou in several manuscript traditions, angels of God. The translators, working in Hebrew and reading this passage in their own language, made a judgment call, and that was it. Now, I want to be fair about what this proves and what it doesn't. It doesn't prove the angelic view is correct. Ancient readers can be wrong, and being early isn't the same as being right. But it does close off one common argument, the idea that the supernatural reading is a modern obsession, cooked up by people who watch too many documentaries. It isn't. It's the oldest reading we have evidence for, and the human interpretations came later. But hold on, because that view has real problems, and the people who reject it are not being careless. They have a text of their own, and it's a sentence from Jesus. Matthew 22. The Sadducees try to trap Jesus with a question about marriage and the resurrection, and he answers that in the resurrection, people neither marry nor are given in marriage, but are like the angels in heaven. Angels don't marry. And that single line is the backbone of the second view, the one that dominated Western Christianity for over 1,000 years. It's called the Sethite view, and it goes like this. Go back a chapter. Genesis 4 and 5 give you two family lines running in parallel. Cain's line, which produces Lamech, a man who boasts to his wives about killing someone, and Seth's line, the other son, the line where it says people began to call on the name of the Lord. Two lines, one faithful, one not. So on this reading, sons of God means the godly line of Seth, and daughters of men means the ungodly line of Cain. The sin isn't supernatural at all. It's the faithful line intermarrying with the unfaithful one until there's no difference left, and the whole world is corrupt, except for one man. This view was promoted by Augustine, and after him it became the standard reading in the Latin West for centuries. And it has real strengths. It keeps everything in the human realm, which means it doesn't have to explain how spiritual beings father children. It fits the flow of the chapters around it, because Genesis 4 and 5 have just set up those two family lines. And crucially, verse 5 says that human wickedness was great, and it's humans God judges. If angels did this, why does humanity drown for it? And I'll tell you now, one of these three views has a piece of evidence the other two don't, and it doesn't come from Genesis at all. It comes from a place you'd never think to look, and we'll get there. Those are good arguments, but the Sethite view has a problem it can't quite get past. The phrase sons of God is never used anywhere in the Hebrew Bible to mean righteous men, not once. If Genesis wanted to say Seth's descendants, it had perfectly ordinary ways to say that, and it used them one chapter earlier. Instead, it reaches for a phrase that everywhere else means heavenly beings.
And there's a second problem. The result. If this is just two groups of ordinary people marrying, why does it produce the Nephilim, described as mighty men, men of renown, the sort of thing that gets remembered for generations? Ordinary marriages don't produce legends. So then there's the third view, and it sits between the other two, the divine king's view. In the ancient Near East, kings routinely claimed divine status. Egyptian pharaohs were called sons of the gods. Mesopotamian rulers took divine titles. It was standard royal language across that whole world. So on this reading, sons of God means human rulers who claimed to be divine. Tyrants. And look at the wording in verse 2.
They took wives from among any they chose. That's not the language of courtship. That's the language of power. Kings assembling harems, taking whatever women they wanted because nobody could stop them. And the Nephilim, on this view, are simply what you'd expect from royal dynasties. Mighty men, warlords, the men whose names got remembered. Not hybrids, just powerful, violent men whose power came from taking.
This view has a real advantage. It explains the why of the flood in moral terms anyone can follow. It's about the strong taking from the weak. And that fits, because the very next thing the text says is that the earth was filled with violence. Its weakness is the same as the Sethite views, the phrase itself. It still has to explain why Genesis uses an expression that everywhere else means heavenly beings. So there they are, 3 views, each with something solid and each with a genuine problem. Angels, Sethites, kings. And before we go further, there's one word in those verses we've been walking past, and it deserves its own moment. Nephilim. Most people assume it means giants, and that's how the Greek translation of the Old Testament rendered it, gigantes, which is where our English word giants comes from in this passage. But the Hebrew is less certain than that. The root most scholars point to is nephal, which means to fall. So Nephilim would mean something like the fallen ones, or possibly those who cause others to fall. Others argue for a root meaning extraordinary or wondrous.
And notice what Genesis actually says about them. It doesn't say they were tall. It says they were gibborim, mighty men, and men of renown. Literally, men of the name, people whose names were known. That's a description of power and reputation, not height. Which is why some careful readers argue the giant imagery may be later interpretation reading back into the text. And they have a point. But then Numbers 13 happens, and the spies specifically compare their own size to the people they saw. So the size element isn't purely invented either. I bring this up because it's a good example of how this whole passage works. Every single term in it is doing more than the English suggests, and the moment you look closely, the text gets stranger rather than simpler. Now, I said I'd be straight with you, so let me tell you which one the Bible's own later writers seem to have had in mind, because 2 New Testament letters take a position, and they're not subtle about it. Jude, verse 6. One short letter near the end of the New Testament, and it says this: "The angels who did not stay within their own position of authority, but left their proper dwelling, God has kept in eternal chains under gloomy darkness until the judgment of the great day."
Angels who left their proper dwelling. And look at what Jude puts in the very next sentence. He compares them to Sodom and Gomorrah, which he says pursued unnatural desire. He puts the two side by side. Whatever those angels did, Jude ranks it in the same category. Then 2 Peter, chapter 2. Peter is listing examples of God's judgment, and he gives 3 in order. God did not spare the angels when they sinned. Then he did not spare the ancient world, but preserved Noah, bringing a flood. Then Sodom and Gomorrah. Angels who sinned. Then the flood. In that order. Peter is walking through history, and the angelic sin comes immediately before the flood. That's the sequence in Genesis 6. And there's one more detail in that verse that almost nobody notices. Peter says God cast those angels into, and the Greek word is tartarosis, Tartarus. It's the only time that word appears in the entire New Testament. It isn't the normal word for hell. Tartarus was a specific place in Greek thought, the deep pit below Hades, where rebellious divine beings were imprisoned.
Peter reaches outside his usual vocabulary one single time to describe where these particular beings went. Now, and I want to be careful here, this does not settle the argument. Defenders of the Sethite view have answers. They point out that Jude and Peter may be drawing on Jewish tradition rather than interpreting Genesis directly. And they're right that Jude quotes the book of Enoch by name a few verses later, which is not in most Bibles. Which brings us to Enoch, briefly. It's an ancient Jewish text, Fragments of it turned up among the Dead Sea Scrolls, so it was circulating well before the New Testament. And it tells the Genesis 6 story at enormous length. A group of watchers who descend, take wives, teach humanity things it shouldn't know, and father giants who devastate the earth. It's the fullest ancient version of the angelic view. It's also not scripture in most traditions, and quoting a book doesn't make it canonical. Paul quotes Greek poets. But it does tell you something important. The people closest in time to Genesis 6, Jewish readers centuries before Christ, overwhelmingly read it as a story about heavenly beings. The Sethite view doesn't appear until the 4th century AD. That doesn't make it right. Old doesn't mean correct. But it does mean the supernatural reading isn't a modern invention. And there's a question hiding underneath all three views that I think is the real reason this passage matters. Why a flood? Think about the scale of that response for a second. God has watched human beings do terrible things since chapter 3. Cain murders his brother in chapter 4. Lamech boasts about killing a man. None of that produces a flood. So what happens in chapter 6 that's different? Each view answers this differently, and the answers tell you what each one thinks the passage is really about. On the Sethite view, the answer is that this is the last line falling. As long as there was one faithful family line, there was a thread God could work with. When that line dissolves into the other one, there's nothing left. The corruption is total. The flood isn't a reaction to one new sin. It's the moment the last uncorrupted thing goes. On the divine king's view, the answer is violence and power. The very next thing the text says is that the earth was filled with violence. If these are tyrants seizing whatever they want, then verse 2 and verse 11 are describing the same disease at two scales. A world where the strong simply take and nobody can stop them. And on the angelic view, the answer is the most drastic of the three. It's not just that people were sinning. It's that the boundary between the created orders had been breached. That something was being done to humanity itself, not merely by it. On that reading, the flood isn't punishment for bad behavior. It's containment. Notice that all three answers share a shape. Something crossed a line that was supposed to hold. That's the point I'll come back to at the end, and it's the reason I don't think you have to settle the identity question to understand the passage. Now let me show you the thing that actually made me want to make this video. It's in Numbers. Because the Nephilim are supposed to be gone. The flood happened. Everything died except one family on a boat. And then, generations later, Moses sends 12 spies into Canaan. 10 of them come back terrified, and here's their report. We saw the Nephilim there. And they add, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and so we seemed to them. The word comes back. After the flood. Genesis 6 even hints at it. Go back and look. It says the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. The text itself flags that this isn't over. And here's why that matters more than it first appears. It reframes the entire conquest of Canaan. Those cities Israel is told to clear out, Anak's descendants, Og of Bashan with his enormous iron bed, the text keeps quietly noting their size and their lineage. Whatever you conclude about Genesis 6, the Old Testament clearly thinks something abnormal was in that land. And once you start following that thread, the Old Testament keeps handing you details it doesn't have to give you. Take Og, king of Bashan. Deuteronomy 3 tells his story, and then it stops to mention something oddly specific. His bed frame was made of iron, and it was 9 cubits long and 4 wide. That's roughly 13 feet by 6. And the text adds, almost like a museum label, that it was still on display in a city called Rabbah. Why include that? Moses is recounting military history, and he pauses to give you the dimensions of a piece of furniture. The text clearly thinks the size is worth recording. Then there's Enoch. The spies in Numbers 13 specifically mention the descendants of Enoch, and Deuteronomy calls them a people great and tall. Joshua later notes that the Anakim were cut off from the hill country, but that some remained in 3 Philistine cities, Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod. Hold on to Gath for a second, because generations later, a young shepherd walks into a valley to face a champion from that exact city, Goliath of Gath. And the text gives you his height, the weight of his armor, and the weight of his spearhead. The kind of specific detail the Bible almost never bothers with for ordinary soldiers. Now, I want to be careful here, because this is exactly where these videos usually leap past the evidence. The text does not say Goliath was a Nephilim. It never makes that connection explicitly. What it does is quieter, and I think more interesting. It tells you Anakim survived in Gath, and later it tells you an unusually large champion came from Gath, and it leaves the two facts sitting near each other. That's the pattern through the whole conquest narrative. The Bible doesn't argue for anything supernatural in Canaan. It just keeps noting sizes and lineages in a book that otherwise doesn't care about either. There's one more thread worth pulling, and it's the one that makes this passage matter for how you read the Gospels. If the angelic view is right, and I'm saying if, then something follows that most people never connect. Because 2 Peter and Jude both say those particular beings are bound, kept in chains, held until judgment. Bound, not roaming. And yet the Gospels are full of spirits that are very much not bound. They're in synagogues. They're in a man among the tombs. They speak, they resist, they beg. So if one group is imprisoned, where did the other group come from? That question is exactly why the book of Enoch mattered so much to ancient readers, because Enoch gives an answer. In that text, when the giants die, their spirits don't go where human spirits go. They're described as remaining on the earth, homeless, restless, looking for somewhere to be. Now, Enoch is not scripture, and I'm not going to pretend it is, but hold that idea next to the Gospels for a moment, and notice how well it fits the details the Gospels actually give you. These spirits are desperate for bodies. They beg Jesus not to send them away. When he casts them out of the man among the tombs, they ask to be sent into pigs, which is a strange request unless being embodied is the point. They don't ask for power. They ask for somewhere to live. I'm not telling you this is the answer. Plenty of serious readers hold that demons are simply fallen angels, full stop, and that view has a long history too. But I think it's honest to tell you that the ancient Jewish world Jesus was born into had a specific explanation for where those spirits came from, and that explanation runs straight back through Genesis 6. Which means these 4 verses aren't a sealed-off curiosity in the early pages of the Bible. Whatever you conclude about them, the ancient readers treated them as load-bearing, a passage that other things rest on. So let me give you the answer I promised. Not which view is correct. I'm not going to hand you a certainty that 2,000 years of serious readers haven't been able to agree on, and anyone who tells you it's obvious is selling something. Here's what the 4 verses are actually doing. Read them again and notice what they're positioned to explain. They come immediately before the flood. They are the last thing Genesis tells you about the world before God decides to end it. Whatever happened in verses 1 through 4, the text presents it as the final corruption, the point where the world had gone so wrong that starting over was the only option left. That's why there's no explanation. Genesis isn't writing a monster story. It's writing a case file. 4 verses of evidence, and then the verdict. And every one of the 3 views ends up in the same place. Angels crossing a boundary, kings taking whatever they wanted, the faithful line dissolving into the unfaithful one. All 3 are describing the same thing, a boundary God set and something powerful stepping over it because it could. That's what the flood answers. Not one specific sin, a world where the line between what may be taken and what may not had stopped meaning anything. And you don't need to settle the identity question to feel the weight of that. So, I genuinely like to know, which of the 3 do you find most convincing? And what made you land there? Angels, Sethites, or kings? I read every comment, and this is one where I actually want to hear the argument. And if there's a passage you've always found strange and never had explained, put it below. Subscribe if you'd like to keep seeing Scripture with fresh eyes. Pray for us, and God bless you.